And so what happens is you're going to see similarities now between the holiday of Easter and the traditions that we celebrate during Easter, and all of these traditions that date back 2, 3, and 4,000 years ago. So right off the bat, we discover that the Easter Bunny comes from that one act that Semiramis did when she broke out of the egg. Let's see if we can find some other traditions as we move along here. Now, every spring, the first Sunday after the vernal equinox, the spring equinox, they have what was called Ishtar's Sunday. And they would have a sunrise service. Now, this part of the legend is difficult to confirm because there's so many different versions. You can make up your own mind whether or not this particular part of the legend will be credited to you. But it is quite interesting how one particular part of the legend lines up so eerily with dying of Easter eggs. Because what they used to do in this part of the legend was that at the sunrise service, the priest of Ishtar would impregnate young virgins on the altar, and during that same service, they would take the babies that were now 3-month-old from the previous year, and they would sacrifice those children on the altar to Ishtar, and then they would take the eggs of Ishtar, and they would dip those eggs in the blood of those young infants. And that is where we get sunrise services, and that is potentially where we get the dying of Easter eggs. It is also interesting to note that worldwide universal color of Easter eggs is red. Even the White House, the official color of the White House Easter egg is ruby red. Now, back to Tammuz. Tammuz gets killed by a wild boar. So every year in commemoration of celebrating the death and the deification of Tammuz, which became the son of God, the son of his father, they would set aside 40 days prior to Easter, and they would fast and they would pray, and they would have a giant feast on Easter Sunday where they would celebrate the death and the resurrection of Tammuz. And guess what they would have for dinner on that Sunday evening? You got it, Easter ham. They would kill a boar in commemoration to Tammuz, who was killed by a wild boar. And yes, the 40 days prior to Easter, where we call it Lent, or the Catholics call it Lent, that 40 days did not come from, my friends, the 40 days of Jesus in the wilderness. That 40 days was already in place for thousands of years before Jesus even showed up. It comes from the 40 days of fasting and praying for Tammuz before they celebrated Easter. The 40 days of the fasting and praying of Jesus, and I like to call him by his Hebrew name, Yeshua, which means salvation. Yeshua's fasting and praying in the wilderness for 40 days is just a coincidence. Why? Because the Father knows the truth, and the enemy used to be the right-hand man of the Father. And he knows the prophecies. He knew exactly how everything was going to be laid out. So he developed all of these traditions of men and all of these legends, whether they be true or not true, but he developed them to skew our foresight and our ability to understand that when the truth would actually come, that we would not recognize it. He created a fraud, and we've swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. And so we begin to see some of these traditions. We discovered where Lent came from. We've discovered where Easter ham came from. We've discovered where the sunrise service came from. We've even discovered why we chose the first Sunday after the spring equinox. We didn't choose it. It's always been there on the celebration of Easter. Now, what's interesting about Easter and Baal, or Semiramis and Baal, is the names. We find these names all over Egyptian hieroglyphics, all these different, the Phoenician hieroglyphics, all these different artifacts from all over the world. And so I'm going to give you some of the names and what they're most commonly remembered for in these different cultures, and some of you will recognize them immediately. First of all, in Egypt, they were known as Isis and Osiris. In Phoenicia, they were recognized as Asheroth and Baal, the very same Asheroth and Baal that you see in the scriptures. In Greece, they were Aphrodite and Adonis, or Eros, where we get the word erotic from. And in Rome, they were called Venus and Cupid. That's right. That's where we get Valentine's Day from, and Cupid. Even in the Far East, listen to this. This is amazing. Cupid was known as Zoroaster. Zoroaster is made up of two words, Zoro, which means seed of, and Asheroth, which is Easter. And so what Cupid actually means in the Far East is the seed of Easter, or the seed of his mother. Okay, and that's from the archives, the bookshelf, February 1994, Volume 2, number 2. We've discovered Easter, Easter eggs, Easter ham, Lent, Cupid, and Valentine's Day, where Easter Sunday is, the sunrise services, and the like. Now we want to move into the scriptures and show you some connections of these names, because you've read some of these scriptures, and it is uncanny how Yahweh, God, always tries to speak to the Israelites and warn them to stay away from Ashtaroth and Baal. Let's read the scriptures. Judges chapter 2 verse 13 says this, "And they forsook Yahweh and served Baal and Ashtaroth." 1 Samuel chapter 7 verse 4 says, "Then the children of Israel did put away Baalim and Ashtaroth and served Yahweh only." And last but not least, in Romans chapter 11 verse 4 it says, "But what says the answer of God unto him? I have reserved to myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to the image of Baal." Now what's really interesting is we are going to discover what that image of Baal is a little bit later in this program. Right about this time, you're probably having that thought that I warned you about hit your brain, saying, that's not what it means to me. I celebrate the birth of Jesus, and I put all the focus on Jesus, and I celebrate His resurrection, and I want to focus on Him. Well, your heart may be to want to focus on Him, and you absolutely may do that. But the truth of the matter is that it doesn't matter how much we focus, how sincere we are, and how pure our hearts are. It only matters that are we worshiping Him the way that He asks us to worship Him, and is anything that we're doing offending Him? Now, later on in the program, we're going to go through the scriptures and see if there are any scriptures talking about Christmas and Easter and any particular instructions allowing us to worship Him in whatever way that we want. But in the meantime, please keep an open mind as we move through the rest of this history and some of these symbols, which are very shocking, that you're going to find out how they moved through time and ended up in our Christian churches today. We're going to start off with a myriad of symbols that we have discovered in archaeology and history that are very related to Christianity in Christmas and Easter, sun god worship, and pagan worship today. So we're going to start off with the most obvious one, or the most important one, and that is Tammuz and his mother Semiramis. If you look on your screen, you're going to see Isis and Osiris, or this is Ishtar and Tammuz. Now, some of you may be asking, well, wait a minute, I celebrate Easter. You're talking about Ishtar. Easter is actually the Anglicization of the word Ishtar. In other words, if you say Ishtar in English, it's pronounced Easter. That's how the etymology of that word evolved over time. What I want you to see is, I want you to see what's on her head is a crescent moon, and in the center of that crescent moon is the actual sun itself. And so the symbol of power of Isis, or Ishtar, was the crescent moon holding the sun itself, her deceased husband, Baal, the sun god. And you can see the baby there that is nursing from her breast. Ishtar was known as the goddess of the East, the bare-breasted fertility god of the East, or the sunrise, which is why they had the service at sunrise on Easter morning. Her husband, on the other hand, was the god of the West, the setting sun. And so you had the goddess, the wife, Easter, of the sunrise, and then you had her husband, which is the god of the West, on the sunset, covering all day long, that the pagan sun gods would rule the earth. Now we're going to move into all the rest of these symbols as we move through these symbols today. Here on your screen you see a pagan carving of the solar deity Baal Hadad depicted as a disc in a crescent. Okay, you can see the half moon disc there in the center of your screen with the sun that is cradled inside of it. And that is the sun god, as well as the crescent moon that surrounds it. Now, as you see that the main symbol for the sun god was the crescent moon with the sun on the top of it, or centered and cradled inside that crescent moon, we now move to something that's a bit controversial but very true historically, is the Catholic Eucharist is actually the sun that is inside of that crescent moon. We're going to show you some pictures of the actual Eucharist in different positions, and you're going to see that not only is it similar, it's identical. This is where they got the symbols from. You can see here, this is a particular object that holds the Eucharist, and I found this online, and this is what the quote said. I left off the particular church for obvious reasons, but this was their advertisement for a particular Friday. It says, Eucharistic adoration is held on the first Friday of every month for the purpose of honoring and praying to the Blessed Sacrament. Now, I don't know about you, but my Bible says to pray to the Father, our Father. Yeshua, Jesus, said to pray to the Father. He did not say to pray to inanimate objects, whether they represent Him or not. Now, look very carefully at, on the right-hand side, you can see the moon, the crescent moon shaped, holding that sun or that wafer of bread. Here's a close-up of it right here. The crescent moon cradle with the sun-shaped monstrance of the Roman Catholic Church. And now you'll see that it's actually the rays of the sun go all the way around this. They didn't hide it at all. Why did they not hide it? Because this is thousands of years old. This comes right out of paganism and sun god worship, where it was the symbol of Baal and his wife Ishtar. And right here you can see the pine cone staff is another symbol found in paganism that's connected with the sun god coming out of Egypt, Osiris. It's kind of in the form of a pitchfork, you can see, where the pine cone is in the center. Now, why did they choose a pine cone? Because a pine cone represents fertility. It comes from the pine tree, which stays green all year round. And so as everything began to die in the winter, the pine tree became a symbol of new hope and life and fertility. And you can see that even in Mexico, they found a Mexican god that is holding a pine cone on one hand, pine cones on one hand, and the pine cone tree on the other. Now, what's interesting is the largest pine cone structure in the world can be found in the Court of the Pine at the Vatican itself. Let me ask a question. Why is a pine cone being found in the Court of the Pine at the Vatican? Why did they choose a pine cone? Why is it that the pine cone can be found on the staff of the Pope himself? Because this staff goes all the way back to ancient sun god worship, where it represented power and authority of the gods, you see. And this is a close-up of that staff right here, where the pine cone is embedded right in the staff itself. Let's move on to another symbol. This is the symbol of the trident. The trident is the devil's pitchfork. It really is a symbol of Satan, of the horns of Satan. It's an ancient satanic and pagan hand gesture called the trident. We find this in archaeology all over the place. Whenever you get into any kind of society of sun god worship, you find the trident everywhere. You see it in ancient Babylon. It was placed in the hands of all the pagan sun gods. All the pagan gods and pharaohs had some sort of trident, a staff, that they would be connected to power and authority of the gods. The most famous one, of course, is Neptune's trident. We call it the devil's pitchfork, and that's where it comes from. It's just not a drawing that someone made up. This has history built into it of where these things come from. Now, if you move forward in time, or during the same time period, you're going to find another symbol that is even more important. As a matter of fact, you're going to see two symbols in this picture. This is a pagan statue of Jupiter that has been renamed St. Peter. And he's holding up, guess what? The trident symbol. That symbol is a satanic symbol recognizing the power of the gods of the sun. And you'll also see another symbol in this picture, and that is the halo. Look real carefully. It's not a halo, it's a sunburst. What they put behind the heads of the gods, or the saints, if you will, is not a halo, it is a sunburst representing the power of the sun god. And they call this St.